The first time I met Clarinda Hensley, she was standing in my driveway, arms crossed over her HOA-issued clipboard like a badge of honor. Her sunglasses were perched on her forehead like a crown, and her lips were pulled so tight I thought they might snap off her face. "You know," she said, eyeing the matte black Jeep Wrangler parked beside my truck, "this isn't a used car lot, Mr. Kellen Carr. Driveway clutter is a violation of HOA guidelines." I stared at her, a half-wilted grocery bag dangling from my hand. I had just gotten back from work construction, long hours, no patience for games, and I was too tired to deal with another one of Clarinda's episodes. This woman had once handed out violation notices for overly aggressive sunflowers. "That Jeep's not mine," I said, walking past her to the door. She clicked her pen. "Then whose is it?" "Not your business." That was apparently the wrong answer. By the next morning, a notice was duct-taped to my door, not slipped in the mailbox, not mailed, duct-taped. Unauthorized vehicle violation, third notice. Third, despite this being the first one I'd ever seen. Typical Clarinda move, I yanked it down and stormed back to the Jeep, still there, still spotless, still unbothered. The windows were tinted, no plates. I'd asked about it once out of curiosity, and the guy who dropped it off just said, "Temporary placement. Official use." Didn't ask more, didn't care. Clarinda, on the other hand, was obsessed. That afternoon, I caught her taking pictures of it from across the street, zooming in like she was on a stakeout. She even squatted behind her mailbox and whispered into her phone. I started grilling on the porch just to annoy her. She finally marched over. "You can't just let strange vehicles loiter around. What if it's stolen?" she hissed. I flipped a burger. "What if it's not?" She narrowed her eyes. "You think you're clever." "No, I think I'm hungry." She stormed off, muttering about code enforcement and community standards. I figured she'd cool down, but Clarinda wasn't the cooling down type. She was the escalate until it explodes type. 2 days later, I came home to find the Jeep roped off with bright orange cones and a laminated pending TOW sign stuck to the windshield. She'd made it official, HOA letterhead and all. I didn't even make it to the front door before 2 black SUVs rolled into the cul-de-sac like a bomb squad. Clarinda, who had been watering her roses and watching my driveway like a hawk, dropped her hose. 4 men stepped out, suits and earpieces. One of them walked straight to the Jeep, peeled off the tow notice and looked around. "Who authorized this?" the guy asked. Clarinda jogged over like she was about to receive an award. "I did. I'm the president of the Oakcrest HOA. That vehicle's been parked here for over 72 hours. It's non-compliant." The agent stared at her. "That vehicle is federal property, assigned to an ongoing investigation." "You just tampered with a federal asset." Clarinda blinked. "Excuse me," he turned to me. "You've been cooperating," I nodded. "Didn't touch it, didn't ask questions." Clarinda's jaw dropped. "Wait, what kind of investigation?" He didn't say anything. "I'm the HOA president," the agent held up a badge. "Ma'am, that Jeep is part of a federal surveillance operation. Your interference has been logged." Then he turned away and said into his mic, "We'll need to debrief the homeowner, and someone call in local PD. We've got an obstruction issue." Clarinda's face went pale. I leaned against my porch railing and took a slow sip of soda. She finally whispered, "You knew," I shrugged. "Told you it wasn't mine." The next morning, I found a folded note shoved behind my screen door, no envelope. Just a single sheet of HOA stationery covered in thick, aggressive cursive. "We will be conducting a full compliance walk-through of your property this Friday at 9 a.m. It is mandatory that you be present. Failure to cooperate may result in community-level sanctions." No signature, but the overuse of underlines and capital letters made it obvious. Clarinda wasn't taking the Jeep incident well. If I had to guess, she spent the night combing through the HOA charter looking for any clause vague enough to weaponize. I wasn't worried, but I was annoyed. So I did what any rational man would do. I called my cousin Riley. Riley was a municipal code inspector for the city. Not the most glamorous job, but she had a talent for sniffing out overreach. She also had a personal grudge against HOAs after hers tried to fine her for installing a rain barrel. "What's up?" she answered, barely above the sound of her garage door rattling open in the background. "You remember Clarinda? You mean the woman who once called animal control because your grill attracted a squirrel?" she asked. "She's planning a compliance walk-through of my property." Riley let out a low whistle. "That's not even a real thing unless it's part of a scheduled review, and they can't demand you be home." She left a note, no signature. "Just threats. Want me to pull her filings?" "Absolutely." By noon, Riley sent me a PDF dump of every HOA incident report Clarinda had filed in the past 6 months. I opened it expecting the usual trash cans left out too long, fences needing paint, someone not edging their lawn with military precision. What I found instead made me sit back in my chair. Clarinda had submitted over 3 dozen incident logs referencing suspicious vehicles, unverified persons, and possible criminal behavior, all centered around my address. She'd been reporting me to the HOA board and occasionally to a private contact she listed only as RM. I forwarded the file to Riley. She called me 5 minutes later. "That's not just excessive, that's harassment. And if she's logging this stuff under a fake contact, she might be fabricating witnesses. Think it's enough to report?" "Oh, I already did. I passed it to the city attorney's office. That got my attention." "You serious?" "Yep." And the city clerk cross-checked RM against the registered HOA board members. No one with those initials. If she's manufacturing evidence, she's in real trouble. I hung up and walked out to the porch. Across the street, Clarinda was rearranging patio furniture with frantic energy, repeatedly glancing toward my house like she expected surveillance drones to swarm her begonias. I didn't wave. Friday arrived with a gray sky and a steady drizzle. I stayed home, not because I had to, but because I wanted to see how far she'd take this. At exactly 9, Clarinda arrived in a bright red raincoat, clipboard in hand, and a tape measure dangling from her belt like a sheriff's pistol. Trailing behind her were 2 junior board members, Artie, who once tried to fine a neighbor for having too many wind chimes, and a woman named Tricia who rarely spoke, but always nodded at Clarinda like her head was on a spring. They didn't knock. They walked the perimeter of my property, whispering, pointing, and scribbling. At one point, Clarinda knelt in the mud to examine a crack in my driveway like it was a crime scene. I leaned against the window, sipping coffee, and waited. At 9:30, a white sedan pulled up. Out stepped a man in a gray blazer, umbrella already open. He walked straight up to Clarinda, flashed a badge, and introduced himself as an investigator from the city's Office of Neighborhood Oversight. Clarinda's posture stiffened like someone had poured cement down her spine. "I'm conducting a follow-up regarding several complaints filed under your name," he said. "I wasn't informed of this visit," she snapped. "You will be now. We received evidence suggesting you may have submitted false reports, impersonated a third party, and attempted to interfere with a federal investigation." Artie backed away like someone had pulled a fire alarm. "I don't know what you're talking about," Clarinda said, her voice cracking. The investigator pulled out a tablet. "According to this log, you submitted complaints referencing a federal vehicle without clearance, attempted to authorize a tow without legal jurisdiction, and listed a witness who doesn't exist." I was protecting the neighborhood. From what, exactly? From suspicious activity. That Jeep was parked outside for days. No plates, no explanation. I had the right to take action. He stared at her for a moment. "You had the right to ask questions, not impersonate law enforcement." "I didn't impersonate anyone. We'll see about that." "We've already subpoenaed your board's communications. If you used your authority to manufacture infractions, you could be facing civil penalties, possibly criminal ones." Clarinda's lips parted, but no sound came out. Then someone spoke from behind me. "That's not the only thing she's done." I turned to see Alina, my next-door neighbor, standing just inside the threshold. I hadn't even heard her come in. She forged a noise complaint against my son after he got home from his night shift. Said he was blaring music. He was asleep. Alina stepped onto the porch, arms crossed. And she fined the Garcias for unsanctioned paint tones even though their exterior color was pre-approved years ago. She's been running this HOA like a personal dictatorship. The investigator glanced at her. Would you be willing to make a sworn statement? Alina nodded. By the end of the hour, the so-called compliance walkthrough had turned into an impromptu deposition. Residents emerged from their homes, one by one, offering stories, unapproved fees, mysterious citations, threats of liens over trivial violations. Clarinda stood frozen in the drizzle, her clipboard held like a life raft. Eventually, the investigator asked her to accompany him to his vehicle. She didn't resist, but she didn't speak either. As they pulled away, Tricia turned to me. I didn't know, she said quietly. She told us everything was cleared with the board attorney. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Later that afternoon, Riley sent me a screenshot. The city had issued a formal suspension of the Oak Crest HOA board's enforcement powers pending a full audit. And the Jeep, it was gone, just like that. No tow truck, no explanation, just an empty space and a few tire tracks in the wet concrete. I didn't ask questions, but I did buy a new grill. And this time, I left it on the front porch. The Monday after Clarinda was escorted off my property, a notice was posted on the Oak Crest Community Bulletin board by the tennis courts. It was printed on plain white paper instead of the usual pre-approved HOA letterhead and bore the unmistakable stamp of city oversight. It read, "Effective immediately, Oak Crest HOA Enforcement Authority is suspended pending full audit and investigation. All fines and citations issued in the past 2 fiscal quarters are frozen. Residents are encouraged to report any irregularities directly to the Office of Neighborhood Oversight." That single sheet did more to bring neighbors together than any block party ever had. By noon, a group had gathered outside Alina's garage, folding chairs arranged in a loose circle and a pot of coffee balanced on a crate in the middle. I stopped by on my way back from the hardware store, and they waved me over like I was a guest of honor. Alina handed me a mug. "You see the notice?" "Yeah, looks like they're not waiting around." I heard Clarinda tried to get the board to hold an emergency vote to reinstate her authority, said Rob from 2 houses down. "Only problem is, she's the only one left who hasn't resigned." That explained the sudden silence from the usual HOA busybodies. With Clarinda under investigation and the rest of the board ducking for cover, the neighborhood was finally breathing. But the celebration didn't last long. 2 days later, a man in a crisp gray suit knocked on my door just after sunrise. He introduced himself as Detective Harlan from the county's Economic Crimes Unit, not local PD, not city, county. "I'm following up on a case involving your HOA," he said, flipping open a leather folder with an official seal. "Didn't think it would go that high," I said, stepping aside to let him in. He didn't sit. Just opened a slim laptop and set it on my kitchen counter. Someone at the county clerk's office flagged a pattern in Oak Crest's financial filings. Discrepancies in vendor payments, to be specific. We traced over 20 separate transactions marked as maintenance consulting to a shell company registered to one Clarinda Hensley. I whistled low. She was billing the HOA for made-up services. Not just that, invoices were backdated, signatures forged. Some of the checks were endorsed by a second party under the initials RM. My stomach sank. That name came up before, witness on the fake complaints. Harlan nodded. "We're trying to identify who that is. Could be a real person. Could be an alias. Either way, we're treating it as a conspiracy to defraud a governing body." He asked if I had any documentation. I handed him the full PDF dump Riley had sent me, plus the printed copy of the violation that started it all. He studied it for a long moment. This Jeep, it was part of a federal surveillance operation. They never told me what for, just that it was government property. Clarinda had it marked for towing without checking anything. Harlan gave a grim half-laugh. She might have done more than that. The Jeep was fitted with a concealed camera unit. The feed was interrupted the night before the tow notice appeared. We think someone tried to disable it. That stopped me cold. She went near it a few times, took photos, never saw her touch it. Doesn't mean she didn't try something after dark. We're pulling street cam footage now. If she tampered with federal surveillance equipment, she's looking at obstruction charges on top of fraud. He packed up without fanfare, but his last words stuck with me. This started as petty power abuse. It's turning into something else entirely. That afternoon, Riley called again. This time her voice had a nervous edge I hadn't heard before. You might want to check your mailbox, not the one attached to your house, the big one at the end of the cul-de-sac. I walked down and found a plain manila envelope wedged between catalogs, no return address. Inside were 11 sheets of paper, each a photocopy of a check made out from the HOA to Oak Crest Maintenance Solutions. The signatures didn't match any of the board members I recognized, but the endorsement stamp on the back of every check was identical: RM. Holdings, I called Harlan. He picked up on the first ring. We've been trying to trace their bank records. You just saved us a week. Whoever dropped these didn't want to be seen. No note, no fingerprints I could tell. Doesn't matter. The endorsement trail is enough. We'll subpoena the bank. If the funds were funneled into a personal account, we'll know. He paused. There's something else. The Jeep. It was monitoring a property 2 streets over, not yours. Your driveway was just the closest unobstructed position. You were never the target. That made sense. Clarinda's obsession with suspicious activity had less to do with safety and more to do with control. She didn't care what the Jeep was doing, only that it hadn't asked her permission to exist. Harlan continued. The house under surveillance belongs to a man named Richard Madsen. Lives alone. No job listed, but he's received multiple wire transfers from overseas accounts flagged by Homeland Security. I blinked. You're saying the RM in all this is potentially tied to money laundering and possibly used Clarinda and the HOA to launder local funds through fake invoices. If she was in on it, she's not just guilty of fraud, she's part of a federal crime. The next few days blurred together. Unmarked cars began cruising the neighborhood. Residents whispered about agents knocking on doors, asking questions about Clarinda's meetings, her habits, who she spent time with. A few people remembered seeing her visit Madsen's house late at night. No one had thought much of it. Then came the arrest. It happened on a Friday afternoon while kids were playing in front yards and sprinklers hissed across the sidewalks. Not loud, not dramatic. 2 plain sedans, 1 unmarked van. Black vests with yellow letters. Clarinda was led out of her house in handcuffs, her mouth moving fast but her eyes darting everywhere like she was trying to find someone to blame. One of the agents carried a box filled with files and what looked like a small external hard drive. They didn't knock on Madsen's door, they kicked it in. He came out in zip ties, eyes half-lidded like he'd already resigned himself to whatever was coming. They found 2 laptops, 6 burner phones, and a stack of prepaid debit cards hidden in a vent shaft. The official charges came out 2 days later: wire fraud, obstruction, conspiracy to embezzle public funds, tampering with federal property. Clarinda had signed off on over $60,000 in fake contracts. Madsen had laundered it through offshore accounts tied to a shell corporation with a Cayman address. The neighborhood held a meeting, not an official one, just a real one, in the park across from the elementary school. No clipboards, no rules, just folding chairs and coffee again. Elena stood up, cleared her throat, and said what we were all thinking. For years, she told us we had to follow the rules, that the board knew best, that we had to accept the fines, the threats, the inspections. Meanwhile, she was using our dues to fund a criminal enterprise. Nobody applauded, nobody cheered, but heads nodded. I walked home under a sky that finally looked like it might clear. The Jeep never came back, but the empty space it left behind, That stuck around for a while. Not just the spot in my driveway, the one in the neighborhood where fear used to live. 3 weeks passed. The neighborhood had gone quiet, not the oppressive, tiptoeing kind it used to be under Clarinda's rule, but the kind that hummed with cautious optimism. Lawns were a little shaggier, porch lights stayed on later, and nobody panicked if a trash bin rolled into the street. People were starting to trust each other again. I was out front staining a new cedar railing when a city vehicle pulled up. A woman in a navy blazer stepped out, heels crunching against the gravel. She carried a leather folio and wore that tired, efficient expression of someone used to cleaning up messes she didn't make. "You Kellen Carr." "Yeah, you with the oversight office," she nodded. "Deputy Counsel Dana Whitaker. I'm heading the civil review of the Oak Crest HOA dissolution. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" I gestured to the porch. "You're the first one who asked permission." She didn't smile, just flipped open her folio and began. "We've been reviewing Clarinda Hensley's tenure as board president. She made several amendments to the community bylaws without proper procedural votes. The city's position is that most of those policies were never legally binding." "I figured as much," I said, wiping my hands on a rag. "She also authorized private security patrols using HOA funds unlicensed, unregistered, and entirely off the books. Did you ever see them?" I nodded. "A white SUV with magnetic decals. No agency name, just a generic eagle logo. They never spoke to anyone, but they'd circle the block at night. We thought it was Clarinda trying to scare people into compliance." "It was. The company listed on the invoices doesn't exist. We traced the payments to a prepaid debit card purchased in cash. She was laundering it the whole time," I said, more to myself than to her. Dana made a small note. "We'll be filing a petition with the county to formally dissolve the HOA. The association is considered legally compromised. Once that's complete, residents can vote to establish a new council with actual oversight and city regulation." "People are still shell-shocked," I said. "You may not get many volunteers. Then we'll install a temporary administrator until you do, but Oak Crest won't be left without a governance framework, not after what happened." As she stood to leave, she paused. "There's one more thing. You're listed as the recipient of the anonymous tip envelope, the one with the photocopied checks." "That's right. We believe the whistleblower was someone from inside the HOA, possibly a board member who got cold feet." Tricia, Dana's brow ticked up. "We interviewed her. She admitted to signing blank checks under Clarinda's direction. Claims she didn't know what they were used for. You believe her?" "I believe she was afraid, but fear doesn't erase liability. She agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced penalty." The real surprise was Artie. I raised an eyebrow. He came forward voluntarily. Turned over emails, Clarinda sent him ones where she explicitly instructed him to ignore resident complaints unless she approved them first. He thought he was just following orders. Now he's helping us unwind the paper trail. Guess it takes a collapse to make people honest. Dana closed her folio. "Sometimes that's the only way forward." She left without ceremony, and I went back to sanding the railing. The wood grain came through in slow, swirling lines, steady, solid, uncomplicated. That night I heard a knock at the door just after 10. Not a pounding, not urgent, just 3 quiet taps. When I opened it, Riley stood there holding a 6-pack and a manila envelope. "Brought something," she said, stepping inside. "You always do." She dropped onto the couch and handed me the envelope. "Final audit summary from the city's finance division. I pulled it through a friend. You're gonna want to see this." I opened it and scanned the top page. "Over $87,000 in unauthorized disbursements," I read. "Multiple vendors fabricated, several invoices duplicated under different names. HOA funds used to purchase electronics, travel, and—" "What is this?" "Cosmetic procedures," Riley said, cracking open a beer. "Clarinda billed the HOA for a private spa membership under the name Executive Wellness Consulting." I let the paper fall to the coffee table. She was stealing from everyone, and no one bothered to check. She made sure of that. Annual meetings were scheduled midweek, notices mailed late. Anyone who asked questions got fined into silence. I always wondered how she lasted so long. She knew how to play the system, but she didn't know how to cover her tracks. I leaned back. Is she actually going to serve time? Riley nodded slowly. The feds are pursuing a plea deal, but it's not going to be a slap on the wrist. She's facing charges from 3 different agencies. Financial crimes, obstruction, tampering with government property. They're stacking it. And Madsen, already indicted, he's cooperating, but he's not walking. He ran wire transfers through Clarinda's shell companies. They've seized his accounts. I stared at the ceiling for a long moment. You know what the worst part is? That she almost got away with it. That if that Jeep hadn't been there, if the feds hadn't parked it in front of my house, none of this would have come to light. Not for another year, maybe more. Riley was quiet for a moment. Then she said, sometimes justice arrives sideways. The next morning, I walked the neighborhood, not out of paranoia, just out of habit. I'd gotten used to watching for things, noticing what didn't fit. What I saw instead was progress. The Garcias were repainting their fence, this time without worrying about pre-approved tones. Elena had strung solar lights around her porch, something Clarinda used to call a fire hazard. Kids rode scooters down the sidewalk without a clipboard, toting adults scolding them for being loud. At the far end of the block, Rob was installing a new mailbox. The old one had been one of Clarinda's pet projects, an ornate, cast iron relic that weighed more than a car tire. HOA issued, of course. He waved me over. You think this one's gonna pass inspection? He joked, holding up a plain aluminum box. Only if it lights up and plays Beethoven, he laughed. Glad that's over, I nodded. Me too. That weekend, the city posted a notice on every door. The HOA was officially dissolved. Until a new council could be elected, the city would handle zoning, waste, and maintenance through its neighborhood transition office. No fines, no inspections, no boards. That night, someone left a small box on my porch. Inside was a single item, Clarinda's clipboard. The same one she used to write violations, measure grass height, document imaginary infractions. There was no note, just the clipboard. I left it in the garage. Let it gather dust.